So the next thing here is Pesach MATZAH MAROR. This is going to be a little bit different than the previous insights we gave. The previous insights we gave were more, if you will, in the world of drush, the world of homiletics, were like nice explanations. We're going to focus a little bit more on the halacha. It's a little bit of a pilpul, but it's geschmack. If you follow along, you'll think you'll enjoy it. Okay, so towards the end of the Maggid, towards the end of the recitation of the story, we say the following. It's a quote from the Mishnah, and that's what I have here, Mishnah. The Mishnah says, Rabbi Gamliel Omer, there's the English is there as well. And the Haggadah lifts this directly from the Mishnah. Rabbi Gamliel would say, whoever has not said the following three items, the Pesach on Pesach, hasn't fulfilled his obligation. The Elohein, and they are the following, Pesach, MATZAH MAROR. So if you haven't said Pesach, MATZAH, and Maror, you haven't fulfilled your obligation. So the first thing is the Mishnah's language is, if you haven't said Pesach, MATZAH, Maror, what does it mean? You need to say the words Pesach, MATZAH, Maror? So then Rashbam explains, the next text there, if you didn't explain them, if you don't explain what Pesach, MATZAH, Maror are, you haven't fulfilled your obligation. And that's what Haggadah goes on to do, and the Mishnah does too. The Mishnah goes on to say, Pesach, what's the Pesach for? The Pesach is for, etc., etc. Matzah, what's the matzah for? Etc., etc. Maror, what's the maror for? Etc., etc. And the Haggadah is lifted almost directly from the Mishnah. There's one little change. We say the Pesach that our forefathers ate, whereas the Mishnah says the Pesach that we eat, because the Mishnah, at least in theory, could have been written while the Beis Midrash is still standing. Maybe there are other small variations between the Haggadah and the Mishnah. I don't remember. Now the question becomes, two questions we're going to address right now. On the Halachik level, when it says, whoever does not explain what Pesach MATZAH MAROR is, on Pesach hasn't fulfilled his obligation. Which obligation? Question number one. Question number two, haven't fulfilled, period, or you haven't done it the best possible? These are two questions we're going to address now. So first, to which obligation? So this is Pirush HaRivan, Eliezer ben Nassan, but there are others who say this. I only selected one source for each opinion, but there are many others that say the same thing, so I'm just sticking with one. Yidei Chevasa, he hasn't fulfilled his obligation. Which obligation? Shall Kriyas Haggadah, the obligation of reading the Haggadah. We mentioned this in the past. There's a commandment to recite the story of the Exodus. How do you qualify what the story is? What's the qualification for retelling the story? So the Mishnah said you have to begin with, the Mishnah just precedes the statement of Rabbi Gamliel says that you're supposed to begin with a place of shame and go to a place of freedom and glory and praise. But it doesn't give more elements of the story. It just tells you the narrative. The narrative should begin with shame and conclude with praise. But what are elements of the story? Not just the narrative arc. What's the arc narrative? But what's the actual elements of the story? So Rabbi Gamliel tells you, here are the elements that will make you fill your story. So which obligation are we talking about? The obligation of reading the Haggadah. Now, even though us in the Haggadah, we already fulfilled our obligation to read the Haggadah, to read the story, we said every single detail already. To read the Haggadah from the beginning till the point where we quote Rabbi Gamliel, we already covered all the details, including why we eat matzah, why we eat Pesach, and why we have maror, all of it. But the Rabbi writes in one of his talks, and that's the next quote here. The truth is, it's interesting because this little passage that I have here is a paragraph that's really an intro to a whole explanation the Rebbe gives, al pi Chassidus, a Chassidic explanation into Pesach, Matzah, and Maror, which I believe the Rabbi talked about on Sunday morning, or maybe last week Sunday morning. But as an intro, the Rebbe says the following, and I probably would have glossed over it had this new Haggadah not made note of it. This is a very beautiful Haggadah, which I recommend reading. I have a relatively big collection of Haggadahs in Hebrew and in English, and this one is in English, and it's from the better ones, surpassing some of the Hebrew ones that I have, meaning commentary on Haggadah. It's a really, really fantastic Haggadah. And here they make a little note, and I looked it up, it's like I read it before, but I never noticed to pay attention to it. The Rebbe writes the following. Pesach Matzah Maror. The Haggadah says Pesach Matzah Maror. And the Rebbe writes like this. Because of the lengthy discussion we've just been doing in the Haggadah up until this point, one can lose the Nekuda, the main points. The Haggadah has so much. So even though we already fulfilled our whole obligation, but you have missed the points because you've been reading so much. Therefore, now that we're holding at the end of the whole retelling of the story, Zotmen, we say, what was the point of the main story? Pesach Matzah Maror. So it's an interesting little note here, in that it should be noted that I mentioned in the first class that the Alter Rebbe writes in his Code of Jewish Law what are the main parts of the Haggadah one has to say in order to fulfill the obligation. This passage, Pesach Matzah Maror, is in that list. But nonetheless, they're telling us here that because you've read so much and you're like, what should I leave with? So the Haggadah reiterates, here are your main points. Pesach Matzah Maror. Because this is the way we're reading now, that Rabbi Gamliel says, in order to fulfill your obligation, we're telling the story, these are your 3 main points. The Haggadah reiterates it, here are your 3 main points. Okay. But that's one reading of to which obligation we're dealing with. This is all if we say the obligation that Rabbi Gamliel is enjoining us to make sure we do is qualifying, is that God, the mitzvah, the obligation of retelling the story. Now we have the Orchos Chaim, and there are others again that agree with this. Rabbi Gamliel Omer Kol Shleimar, etc. The last text on the first page. Kol meaning to say, even though he will have eaten his Pesach offering, he will have eaten his matzah, he will have eaten his maror, he will have not fulfilled his obligation of what? Of eating Pesach matzah and maror. Built the amira without saying what it is about. The Torah was scrupulous to tell you about telling. V'agadah, you should say it. For this reason, when he has matzah and maror in front of him, the Torah relates to the process of doing the Pesach and eating the matzah and eating the maror with telling it. And therefore, this reading of Rabbi Gamliel is that in order for you to fulfill your obligation of eating Pesach matzah maror, you have to say these things. Some people think, according to this opinion, if you ate matzah on the night of Seder, but you didn't read that paragraph, you will have not fulfilled your obligation to eat matzah. It's incredible. It's so counterintuitive to what you would have thought. But this is the way he learns it. Okay. Oh, actually, I read that somewhere, that someone writes, the Bach explains that mitzvah tzrichas kavana, because if you don't know what you're doing with the mitzvah, you're lacking the whole mitzvah. And therefore, as part of that, you have to actually say what the matzah and Pesach are for, otherwise you're lacking in the mitzvah. I saw someone that writes that. I didn't quote it in here, but I saw someone that says that.
Eaten it before you got to this.
Which order is what? I don't know. Because this comes right before you eat matzah, right? Right after this, you drink the second cup of wine, make the bracha, drink the second cup of wine, and then you go to write the matzah. Okay, go to the next page. Skip the next text for now. Maybe we'll get back to that. And here, the question is, to what degree? To what degree have you not fulfilled your obligation? So the Ran, which is a classic commentary on the Gemara, writes on the Gemara, on the Mishnah there, which this Haggadah is taken from, this passage Haggadah is taken from. So first he quotes the Mishnah, which says, Kol b'shalei omar sheish dvarim elu, whoever does not say these, we think Pesach lo yaseh dechavaseh, they didn't fulfill his obligation. Says the Ran, Koloimar, meaning to say, lo yaseh dechavaseh karoi, he hasn't fulfilled his obligation in the best possible manner. But he's not going to go so far as to say you haven't fulfilled your obligation at all, but just not the best. And a similar thing can be found in Sukkah. In Cain, I should have quoted the rest of it, but there in the Sukkah it talks about where one sage told another that if you did Sukkah the way you said you did it, you've never fulfilled Sukkah in your life. So many learn this to mean that you've never actually fulfilled the mitzvah of Sukkah, but you haven't done it the best possible way. So even though he's using the language of you haven't fulfilled your obligation, he doesn't mean literally you haven't fulfilled your obligation, but it's not the best possible way. Now the Ran is unclear which obligation he's talking about. One could argue he's talking about either. He doesn't say which one. He just says that when Rabbi Gamliel says you haven't fulfilled your obligation, it means you haven't fulfilled your obligation in the best possible way. But which one are we talking about? He doesn't say. It might apply to both. From the Rebbe's Haggadah, meaning again the Haggadah that Rebbe wrote with commentary, it seems that he learned that the Ran is talking about the first option of retelling the Haggadah. That when the Ran says that you fulfilled your obligation but not in the best possible way, he means the mitzvah to tell the story. Why do I say this? Because right after this, the Rebbe cites a bunch of opinions which say that in the night of the Seder you don't have to retell the whole story anyway, you just have to mention the story. Right? We mentioned, I think, once that we have a commandment every day to remember the Exodus from Egypt, right? So what's the difference between the Seder and the rest of the year? So some learn that it means you have to actually retell it with the whole elaborate details. Others say you don't have to do that. You can just mention we came out of Egypt, thank you very much, and that's enough. According to some opinions, to fulfill the biblical commandment. If that's the case, then when Rabbi Gamliel says you haven't fulfilled your obligation, it can't be literally not fulfilling your obligation to retell the story, because you don't have to do that at all. And therefore you must learn like the Ran, which says you haven't fulfilled your obligation in the best possible manner, but you still got your obligation at least somewhat. So because of the context, it would seem that the Rebbe is learning in this Ran that the Ran follows like the first interpretation that we're talking about, the retelling of the story. But others don't read the Ran that way. Others read the Ran that he's actually talking about the other one. The one which says that in order to fulfill the obligation of eating the Pesach matzah maror, you have to say what they're about. The Ran is saying that if you ate your matzah, but you didn't tell what it was about, you fulfilled your obligation, but not in the best possible manner. That's other way of reading it. So we'll skip the next text, but the Me'idi is clear that he's talking about the mitzvah of retelling a story, and that mitzvah isn't done in the best possible way if you don't make these three things, but you still will have fulfilled your obligation, at least on the bare minimum, if you didn't say these three items. Now we have a Tosfos. The Tosfos on the Gemara there, which says, right, because the verse that Rabbi Gamliel cites to prove that you have to be talking about the Pesach offering is because the Pasuk says, and you shall say, this is a Paschal offering because, etc., etc. Implying that with your Pesach offering, you have to say it. And that's what Rashi says. That's what he says. Pirush, meaning to say, ba'amida, with speech, you must say, Pesach zeh, this Pesach, that you are eating is for such and such a reason. The iskish, and the verse compares matzah maror le Pesach, matzah maror to Pesach. And therefore you must say, Nami as well, matzah this matzah maror zeh, this maror. What is the Tosfos saying here? What Tosfos is telling you is, it's not just a nice thing that in other words, when Tosfos tells us why you have to say this is the maror, this is the Pesach, this is the matzah, he doesn't say because you need to tell the story in its full. Tosfos cites a verse describing Pesach eating, and the Pesach eating has to come along with a telling, and matzah and maror are to be compared with Pesach. Therefore, matzah and maror also be done with telling. Context clearly is that he's talking about the eating, to fulfill the obligation of eating these three items. You have to retell what they're about. And moreover, because he's citing it from a verse directly, the implication is that you will not fulfill your obligation at all because you didn't do half the verse. So it seems from Tosfos, and this he follows the same way in Sukkah, the case I mentioned in Sukkah, where the Gemara says one sage told another sage that you haven't fulfilled your obligation. And I said that most people learn it means you haven't done your obligation in the best possible manner, but you have fulfilled your obligation at least in the bare minimum. Tosfos there says, no, it means literally, you haven't fulfilled your obligation, period. And therefore, if we're going to compare the two cases of Sukkah and the Pesach story here, it would follow that Tosfos is of the view that if you haven't said why you're eating the matzah, you have not fulfilled your obligation of eating matzah. It's quite heavy. So, recap a little bit. We have two different obligations we're dealing with here. When Rabbi Gamliel just said, if you haven't spoken about these three things, you haven't fulfilled your obligation. Which obligation? One of two. Either the obligation to retell the story, or the obligation of eating. That the eating of these three items needs to be accompanied by a retelling of what they're about. Now, in either of these two versions, you can read it one of two ways. Either you can read it that you haven't fulfilled your obligation at all of retelling the story if you haven't told the story of these three things, or you can say you fulfilled your obligation, but not in the best possible manner. Or the other way, if you've eaten these three things but you haven't said the story, you haven't fulfilled your obligation of eating those things at all. It's as if you didn't eat it. Or you've eaten it and you fulfilled your obligation, but you haven't done it in the best possible way because you didn't tell the story behind the mitzvahs. Right? This is a very interesting little helpful, if you will. Okay, the Aruch LaNer kind of elucidates a little bit what we said here. Okay, let's do one more thing. This is the nice thing. We'll go back to that text we skipped on the second page, the Marsha. And this is not so much pilpul and halacha, but it's a little drush, so we'll conclude with this because it's a nice thing. If you want to repeat this at the Seder, this idea that according to some opinions, if you haven't retold the story of what you're eating, you haven't fulfilled your obligation. It's a very heavy idea. It's maybe some sauce to go along with that. And this comes from the Marsha, his commentary on the Gemara. And he says, mitzvahs, We haven't found in other commandments the boy yomer that you're required to say bahen on these mitzvahs al shema al shema for what they are there. Tisagalu bracha on mitzvahs. It's enough to make a bracha on the mitzvah. So why all of a sudden these 3 mitzvahs all of a sudden you have to tell them? No other mitzvah they have to say what they're for. Even when it comes to putting on tefillin, we were told you have to have in mind the different things what tefillin's for. That God commanded us, that it's a connection of your heart and mind. But if you don't have that in mind, first of all, you fulfill your obligation for sure, and you don't have to say it. But here all of a sudden there's some opinions that go so far as to say that if you haven't done it, you haven't fulfilled your obligation of eating matzah. What's the story? The reason is, it's stated in the beginning of the first chapter of Tractate Zvachim. Zvachim is the tractate which deals with the laws of sacrifices in the temple. And there it says, all sacrifices that were offered with the wrong intention, meaning they weren't made for the sake of the right person, are valid. Means they weren't done with the intention of fulfilling this proper obligation for this proper person, are valid except for the Pesach offering and the sin offering. The psulim shaloi lishmon, they are invalid if they aren't done with the intention that this offering is for this person. This is true of the Pesach offering and the sin offering. The Tama Inyan, and the reason there is Mefurish explained, Sham over there, because of the distance that they have been being distant from holiness. So say let's sin offering. It's easier to understand it there. Sin offering is a person was distant from Hashem, distant from holiness because of a sin. So boy tzvei kiruv l'kedusha, and therefore he needs an extra pull to bring him closer to holiness because he came from a place of distance. Dahainu zvicha l'shma, and that is why we offer the offering in his name, whereas the offering of the sin offering has to be offered with the intention that it's being done for this and this person. Because so that way there's more strength, if you will, in that offering to bring that person close because he was distant. And therefore, Rabbi Gamliel says that not just the offering, but even the people who are eating, the owners of the Pesach offering who are eating, it should be clear that he's doing it for this purpose, to come closer to holiness. And he goes on to explain how each of these 3 items, Pesach, MATZAH MAROR, are someone who is at distance coming closer. The Pesach offering, right when they came out of Mitzrayim, they were sunk in the impurity of Egypt, and through the Pesach offering, God brought them close, especially considering the fact that the Pesach offering was a lamb, which was their idol, and then you're using it to come to holiness. And therefore, just like a sin offering, which requires extra intention to bring the person who is distant closer to Hashem, so likewise the Pesach offering, which is all about coming closer to Hashem, it needs that extra push of the person to say, here is why I'm doing it, because I was distant and I'm coming closer. And likewise the matzah. Matzah is about getting rid of ego, and therefore a person has to verbalize, to give that extra push, and say, even though I may have get carried away with my own ego, I'm here eating matzah to acquire some humility. And likewise at the maror, where a person is declaring that even though my life may have been spiritually bitter, I'm here pushing that away, but through fulfilling the mitzvah of the evening. So it's kind of like some sauce to this idea, some homiletic, some drush behind this halacha, at least according to some opinions, that you will not fulfill your obligation of eating these 3 items unless you've actually verbalized what they're all about. All right.